What's up, everybody? It's Charles. So right here next to me is a 2-liter turbo engine out of an Audi. I think it's out of a Q5 or something like that. Doesn't really matter what it is because this is a super common engine. And this engine has some type of failure, assuming it's going to be a timing chain tensioner failure. What we're going to do in this video is we're going to tear this engine down, do some thorough inspections, analyze what's wrong with it, what we need to fix it, and I'm going to show you guys some of the really common things that happens to these engines. All right, so here's our 2-liter. As you can see, this engine doesn't look like it's been super well maintained over its life, so it's really no surprise that it's having some kind of issues. Let's start off by checking the timing chain tensioner. If you were doing this in the car, there would be a dipstick funnel that ran right across the front here between the pulley and the cover. Not a big deal, you can still work around it. Also, if you were doing this in the car, especially on an engine you were trying to salvage, we would want to clean all this up because we don't want any of this falling down into our oil pan. You can see just how nasty this timing cover really is. We'll take our flat blade screwdriver and just work this little cover off. All right, I'm noticing right away that we have our old style tensioner. When you see this little gray band on the tensioner, you know for sure this is the old type. For comparison, here's what our new style tensioner looks like. Our next step is going to be to set the engine in base timing to see how far off our timing actually is. That'll start with us rotating the crankshaft around and lining up our TDC marks from our crankshaft pulley to our timing cover. Now, there will be a few small differences between the VW engines and the Audi engines, mostly on the accessory side. This pulley is not on the VW engines. I'm gonna go ahead and remove it now. This is a T40 fastener. So I'm gonna put my T40 bit in and just give it a little tap. Didn't feel like the bit was going in well enough. Go ahead and remove that. Next, let's clean some of this caked on oil residue and debris off so we can actually see our timing marks. Man, this stuff is thick on here. Now, this engine actually has 2 different timing marks on the timing cover. There's one that's going to be right about 12 o'clock on the cover up at the top, and then one that's down here at the, 4:45 or so time. This is the one that we're going to use. I'm going to go ahead and add my own mark right on the factory mark so that we can see it a little easier. And then this pink mark is going to correspond to a mark on the pulley. What we'll do is we'll rotate the engine around clockwise, always clockwise only, and set that to TDC. That didn't sound good. We're not dead on, but we're pretty close. And I think this engine is toast anyway, so being off a millimeter or 2 doesn't really matter. If you're not sure whether your timing marks are lined up, take a screwdriver and just lay it in the timing mark and see if it lines up. You can see we're off just a little bit. Not a big deal though. This will be close enough for us. All right, now that we have our crankshaft lined up, let's look at our camshafts. What I usually do to take a quick glance is if I look just behind the chain, I can see the camshaft. Here on the exhaust cam, you can see that little notch in the camshaft. That should be facing inward so that we can access the cylinder head bolt. You can actually take the cylinder head off without taking the camshafts out. As we slide over to our intake cam, we're actually seeing that notch about 90 degrees out of where it should be. So that groove on the exhaust cam is like this, the groove on the intake cam is like this. This camshaft is about 90 degrees out of time. Next, let's go ahead and get this pulley off. Before you remove one of these pulleys, there is a key tool that you need to have. And it can be the fancy VW tool, it can be a little donut piece like this, or honestly, a stack of washers, 3/4 of an inch thick will also work. When we take this bolt out, we're gonna take the crank pulley out. This bolt not only holds the crank pulley on, it also holds the crankshaft gear that drives all our chains to our crankshaft itself. So if you take this off and start screwing around with moving the engine, you're gonna get your engine out of time. For us, this is not a big deal, but if you're doing a chain tensioner or doing some kind of oil leak, you will almost guaranteed to get your engine out of time, and that is not what we want to do. So you better have one of these guys, or again, the fancy VW tool, which is actually way nicer than this one because it holds everything together much better than this. Now that I've yelled at you about that, let's go ahead and get this pulley off. We're going to need some kind of counter hold tool. This one's got 4 pins in it and an opening so that we can put our socket through. This one came from my man Paul at Shop DAP. I'll be sure to link up all the tools that you'll need for this job down in the description. So we put our counter hold in, we take our 24mm socket, and we loosen it. Now this is gonna come off super easy because it wasn't that tight to begin with. Yours will be much tighter than that. I like to take and hold the pulley, take the bolt out, hold the bolt in your hand, take the pulley off, set the pulley down, get your donut, put your donut on, and then put the bolt back where it goes and snug it down. That's the order you need to do it. You need to do it that fast. Again, otherwise you run the risk of messing up your timing of your engine, and we don't want to do that. So now all of that is secured. The pulley is also sort of keyed to that gear. You can see these little grooves here in the pulley. You'll notice one is like a double notch right here. This corresponds to another spot in the gear. If you don't put it on that way, you end up crushing these notches, and that bolt right here can actually back out and destroy your engine. I have seen it more than one time. Next, let's take off our cam bridge. This is another place that is an ultra common failure point. Anything from oil leaks from this seal right here to the screen coming out and causing oil starvation issues to the back of the cylinder head. We're gonna start by removing our spool valve. This is our controller for our variable valve timing. You'll notice there's 2 little notches here. There's actually a couple of different styles of spool valve. They all have 2 notches. Some are centered across from each other and some are offset. This is the tool that we need to remove that spool valve. You can see these are basically centered at like 9 and 3. And if we flip it this way, it's like 10 and 2. We need the 10 and 2 side. We'll go ahead and put this in. Key point here, this spool valve is counter threaded or reverse threaded. So you need to set your wrench to on in order to loosen it. Something else you're gonna probably wanna do is put a wrench right behind the cam adjuster to hold the camshaft while we take the spool valve out. An 18mm open end wrench works perfectly. So we'll counter hold, put our tool in, loosen that up. We'll take our spool valve out, maybe. There we go, come on. You wanna do a pretty thorough examination of this piece, especially if when we take this off, we're missing the screen, because the screen in the oil passage here can actually get caught inside of this spool valve. Next, we're gonna take out these T30s and this triple square here. We'll start with our number 10 triple square. The VWs and Audis have different bolts here, so this may actually be an Allen, not a triple square. Then we'll take our T30s out. If you're doing this as like maintenance or just an inspection, it's not a bad idea to shove a rag right here. That way, if one of these bolts falls, it doesn't fall down behind the timing cover. That can make for a pretty bad day. We're taking ours all the way apart, so we don't need to worry about that. Just a bit of advice if you're doing this to replace it or as maintenance, stuff something down here so nothing falls behind it. This is also a pin. We want to make sure we retain that as well. You may need to rock this off because this actually supports the camshafts in the front of the engine. Not much of a surprise here that our screen is actually missing out of our bracket. Luckily, it's actually right here in the cylinder head. Sometimes what'll happen is this will actually go and get stuck in the spool valve like I mentioned, or further down in this oil galley, either one of these 2 oil galleys, and cause severe oil starvation at the back side of the engine. And ours is right here, so we can just set it with our cam bracket. Next, let's move up to the top side of the engine. Our PCV valve and our ignition coils are already been removed. What we're trying to do is take off the camshaft bridge. A lot of people call this a valve cover. PCVs are already mostly removed. We'll just undo this and we will get this the rest of the way off of here. This actually exposes our camshaft. Here's another good look at that little channel I was talking about on the intake cam. At TDC, rather than facing like 9 and 3, this should be 12 and 6, so you can see we're way out of time. Remove this hose here, unplug our cam position sensor. We'll actually go ahead and remove that. Next, let's get the vacuum pump and high pressure fuel pump off. We'll undo our high pressure fuel line here. If you're doing this in the car, you will probably want to slowly bleed that fuel pressure off. Here's our lobe that drives that high pressure fuel pump. I've even seen that screen we were talking about a minute ago. I've seen that screen stuck in here because it traveled all the way through that oil galley from the other side of the engine. Couple of things before we take this cam ladder, cam bridge, or valve cover off. This is a valve lift car, so we have these solenoids at the back of the cylinder head on the exhaust cam side. We're gonna need to remove this one in order to get to this bolt right back here. If you're doing this as maintenance, you're actually going to need to set the proper positioning of those with these little slider pins. Remove the solenoid, you drop this little pin in, and as you rotate the engine around, it sets the pin in the proper position. Our timing's toast, there's no need to keep moving it around. So we'll remove our first solenoid here. That's a T25 Torx. Next, we're gonna take out all these T30 bolts holding this to the cylinder head. When we're removing a component like this, we want to make sure that we're removing it in the right order. We start at the outside and work our way in. When we're tightening it, we start in the middle and work our way out. So we're going to remove this side first, then go to the outside and back and forth till we get all the bolts out. And when we remove our final one, this valve cover is probably going to pop up a little bit. Don't worry, that's going to be okay. We'll grab our small pry bar and we'll just ease this cover up. Should come up pretty easily. You want to be careful, you don't get too aggressive down here on the metal-to-metal contact surface. We don't want to mar up the cylinder head. And we will gently lift our cover off. Take our gasket off for our vacuum pump. And here we go, here's our camshafts. These sleeves right here are for our Audi valve lift. That provides the different profiles on the exhaust cam: low lift, low duration, higher lift, longer duration. So from here, everything actually looks okay. I don't see any rockers that are blown off. I don't see any severe cylinder head or camshaft damage. The odds of not having any bent valves is pretty low, but that's okay. Let's move back to the front and get that front timing cover off so we can get this chain off. Actually, from here, if you really wanted to, you can just take the chain off. You can swing the cams up and take the chain off and pull the cylinder head off right here. Let's go ahead and take our lower timing cover off next. So a series of T30 bolts that we're gonna need to remove. Now once you have all the bolts, you'll find that the cover doesn't just pop right off. In fact, you can get a pry bar and try and pry it off, and oftentimes that doesn't work very well either. This cover is a one-time use cover. Once you take it off, you probably don't want to put it back on because it's darn near impossible to get it off without manipulating it or tweaking it in some kind of way. That being said, I really don't also like to just destroy the cover or go prying on our engine or our oil pan or anything like that. So what I found is taking a very thin scraper or like a putty knife or something and getting here in the side of the cover between the block and the cover is really the best way to get this off of here. If you just get it a little bit between the block and the cover and just tap gently with a hammer, you can get between the block and the cover, and then all you got to do is just work your way around it. Even taking your time and doing it this way, you want to replace this cover. This is also the method that I use for oil pans because this kind of thing breaks the sealant up, makes it much easier to get off the car, and you don't destroy the pan. All right, here is our timing circuit. At the front, we have our oil pump circuit. The middle, we have our timing circuit, so our crankshaft to camshafts. And then in the back, we have our balance shaft circuit. We'll start by detensioning the tensioner for the oil pump drive. This one you can pretty much do by hand. We'll take a small pin, just slide it in, that'll hold it on. There's no timing or anything for this oil pump drive, so we don't really need to worry about that. We can actually just go ahead and take it off. This one is not something I usually replace when I do this kind of job. Some of these you actually can't get the oil pump chain off with all this installed. You have to kind of do it all together. This one we can just work around and just leave that hanging down there. Next we have our timing chain circuit. Here's our tensioner. You can see how much movement that timing chain tensioner really does have. What you would normally do is you would take a pin and you would go right in through here, release tension, draw this all the way back, and then stick a lock down here. That'll hold the tension off the chain. For us, we know we're in a pretty bad way here, so I'm just gonna go ahead and take the tensioner off. Want to be careful here in case things go flying. There is a spring inside this tensioner we want to be aware of. Let's look at the failure of this tensioner. Here's our teeth that are supposed to hold our locking positions. Let's slide that off. Your entire engine timing of your vehicle all relies on this tiny little piece with these little grooves, and the grooves actually wear out and get super duper sad, and that's one of the reasons why it lets go, in addition to that like lack of lubrication and stuff. So no surprise that it's been redesigned and there's been more than one revision. All right, now our chain has no tension on it. We can actually go ahead and pull this chain completely off. Here's our old nasty faily timing chain. Something else we want to consider is chain stretch, not just the tensioner failing. Here I have in front the old chain we just took off, and right behind it a new chain. And just by looking at the two, you couldn't really tell the difference, but if we hang them on something evenly and go all the way down to the bottom, you can actually see that our chain is stretched just a little bit. It's just a little tiny bit longer. That little bit of stretch or that little bit of wear on the chain, coupled with a weak tensioner, is typically what causes the catastrophic failure. Here's our old nasty faily timing chain. If you are just doing a timing chain tensioner as maintenance or a stretch or something like that, and you don't have any engine damage up top, or even if you do, you don't need to mess with the balance shaft chain. That's this back chain here. You can leave it on the car, and that's totally cool. I'm gonna take it off because I wanna actually pull the balance shafts and inspect those. But if you're not doing that, don't mess with it. They're in time now. You don't wanna mess it up and get it out of time because that will cause an engine vibration. Here's our tensioner on the side. Looks very similar to a VR6 timing chain tensioner. If you're going this far and doing this much work, it's actually not the worst idea to replace this, but it is serviceable outside of the engine if you need to, so it's not the end of the world, but if you're going this far, you might as well replace it. Next, we're gonna unbolt our guides for our timing chain. We also really want to evaluate these guides. If you're going this far, replace them. Don't waste your time not. But we want to evaluate them because if they're broken, we might need to pull the oil pan off and look for broken plastic. Take our other guide off. Now that we have everything off, we can actually take this bolt out and take our gear that drives all our chains off. If you look right at 12 o'clock of this gear, there's a notch and a flat spot. That flat spot, that tiny little flat spot, is technically the key that's supposed to line up to this flat spot right here on the crankshaft. Yes, it's a tiny little flat spot here, and a tiny little flat spot here. And what I've seen people do is not pay attention, get this gear off a little bit. When they go to tighten this down, it crushes this part of the gear. Not only are they out of time, your bolt's not properly torqued, and then the bolt will back out and you'll lose timing and end up with catastrophic engine failure. All right, now that we have the timing chain off and that stuff dealt with and evaluated, it's time to pull the cylinder head. I'm gonna actually take the turbocharger off and the intake manifold off, mostly because it's gonna make taking the cylinder head off quite a bit easier. You guys know what that means. Cue the time lapse. There we go. All right, now that we have pretty much everything off of this engine, we can take our camshafts off nice and easy. We want to do a thorough inspection on the journals, make sure we don't have any scoring from lack of oil or anything like that. If you have variable valve lift, don't slide these. There's a ball and a spring under heavy spring pressure where if you slide them, the ball and the spring go flying, and then you probably will never find them ever again, ever. Next, we are going to unbolt our cylinder head. It is pretty much that easy. Just like we did with the cam cover, we're going to start on the outside and work our way in. We actually have 4 T30s here on the front of the engine that we're going to need to take off. Now we should be able to lift the cylinder head right off. We'll just do a quick check, make sure we didn't miss anything. Everything looks good. Take this pry slightly just around, make sure we don't have anything hung up. Now we can lift her right off. This isn't too heavy, but you may want to grab a buddy or a not buddy and have them give you a hand with it. We're looking at the top of cylinder 4 piston. This indent right here, that's supposed to be there. That's normal. But if we wipe this goop and carbon off, we will see, that our valve made impact to our piston. And when the valve makes impact to the piston, it is bent. Now, you want to take a really close look at these because I have actually seen chipped pistons from these timing chain tensioners letting go. So here's cylinder 1, kind of the same thing. We can see some impact damage. I wouldn't not use these pistons because of that. It just means that we're almost guaranteed to have bent valves. You can see the impact damage right there. A little bit right there. See what cylinder 2 and 3 look like. Well, there's a lot of goo on top of the pistons, that's for sure. And it looks like we're seeing the same damage basically we saw. So let's look at the cylinder head and see what it looks like. All right, here is our cylinder head. These are our exhaust valves. These are our intake valves. You can see a little bit of a mark there where there was some impact, little mark there where there's some impact. It may be a little hard to see in the video, but this valve is clearly not seated properly. That's going to be cylinder 1. Cylinder 2, this intake valve right here, clearly not seated all the way. Cylinder 3. Cylinder 4 looks like it might actually be seated all the way. Either way, it doesn't really matter. We got at least 3 cylinders with bent valves. You can actually see a lip of carbon buildup right there on the exhaust side. On the intake manifold side, it's actually pretty tough to see valves bent. And it's really hard to get a camera in there. So what I did was I dropped a flashlight underneath it. And you can see light straight through. This is cylinder 1. You can see light straight through showing just how bent they are. There's no camshaft on the engine, so there's nothing to push the valves down. All of our valves, exhaust and intake, should be closed at this point, but clearly we're seeing light straight through there, so we got bent valves. Something we also want to make sure we pay attention to and consider is damage to the camshafts. What I've seen a couple of times is the lobes actually spinning. That'll look like one lobe being here, and instead of the other one facing the same direction, it'll be turned a little bit. Usually you can see that without having to get a measuring device on it and measure it. Here we have our water pump, and shockingly enough, our water pump is leaking on this engine. This is probably one of the most common issues on this series of 2-liter engines. Another really common thing is actually going to be a leaking rear main seal. As far as I can tell here on ours, it actually looks pretty good. Maybe it was replaced at some point. Well, there we have it. I don't think there's any surprise that this was going to be the kind of damage that this 2-liter had. Clearly we have 1, 2, probably all 4 cylinders with bent valves. It's really going to be in the best interest of this engine to pull the bottom end apart too and evaluate the pistons because Audi is known for having oil consumption issues. So there we have it, probably, I don't know, $3,000 or so worth of engine repairs needed. No wonder the car got a different engine rather than trying to rehab this one. Guys, if you have questions or comments, drop them down below. If you like the video, do me a favor, hit that thumbs up button and give the video a share. There's probably somebody out there running around with an old timing chain tensioner that needs to get that addressed before their engine ends up like this one right here. So guys, with that, I'm out. Have an awesome day, and I'll talk to you again next time.